A country known for its neutrality is flexing its military might. After holding massive war drills, we ask if Sweden is siding with NATO in response to perceived Russian aggression. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Sweden. On the eve of Russia's biggest display of firepower, Sweden put on a show of its own. 19,000 troops took part in the country's largest war games in 20 years. The military maneuvers were supported by NATO. That's an organization Sweden has long steered clear of until now, as the government considers joining the alliance. But Moscow has warned Stockholm against that decision, even though President Vladimir Putin promises that his country poses no threat. So, could this be the end of the Swedish policy of non-alignment? And how do Swedes feel about it? Randolph Nogel traveled there to find out in this first report in a special series from Sweden.
Even from a distance, this tranquil island appears more of a tourist destination than a military outpost. Walking down its cobblestone streets and past its monuments, there are few signs that Gotland was once regarded as the tip of Sweden's sword. Now, as it hosts the country's largest war games in 20 years, it's being sharpened dramatically.
It's in the middle of the Baltics, and it is a part of Sweden which will be important to defend in basically all scenarios that we can come up with.
A hypothetical first strike by an enemy on Sweden could target Gotland. And that's why the military and emergency workers are training together.
This is the aftermath of an attack that would provoke an all-out war. All of the victims in this scenario are members of the Red Cross. This exercise is not only about military and civilian units working together, but also about getting people who are critically injured to hospital.
Gotland was demilitarized following the end of the Cold War. These officers showed us one of the secluded areas where air defense systems are being resurrected.
We have already decided on buying a new air defense system, and we are looking into a second one.
We had no troops there, no equipment really for a number of years, but now it's coming back gradually. This has to do with the realization that anything happens in the Baltic Sea area, Gotland will be involved.
Gotland, which sits just 350 kilometers from the Russian enclave Kaliningrad, is pivotal for NATO's influence in Baltic states, where tension with their eastern neighbor has risen.
What they have in Kaliningrad is really scary to us. If they fire one of their missiles from Kaliningrad into Sweden, we have no air defense system that can handle this. Not a chance. It's a bit like we're back in the old days of the Cold War.
Back on the mainland, just outside of the capital Stockholm, Swedish forces are preparing for the final phase of the Aurora 17 war games. A ground invasion.
At its peak during the Cold War, Sweden boasted 800,000 troops and the fourth largest air force in the world. The show of force put on by these powerful weapons are warning shots that the country may again be a regional force to be reckoned with.
The Prime Minister and Defense Minister, who've spearheaded Sweden's military buildup, were on site to observe.
We're building a cooperation with other countries, signed several cooperation agreements, and we will keep on doing that. So it will strengthen Swedish capacity, yes.
And the reason is that we have had a Russian annexation of Crimea, we have a war going on in Ukraine, we have pressure towards the Baltic states, and we have more of activities in the Baltic Sea area. So this is an exercise in a new security environment.
Sweden's leaders acknowledge that military support from allies like the US, France, Denmark, Norway, and the Baltic states, who have all taken part in the games, are crucial. All are NATO members, but Sweden's government is wary of its war games being called a NATO exercise.
It's a bilateral arrangement with those countries participating here. It's not a NATO exercise.
Sweden has maintained a policy of neutrality for 200 years. Now that it's in the EU, the preferred term is non-alignment. But strengthening ties with NATO have raised concerns among some that its legacy of independence is slipping.
The government, especially the Social Democrats, they say we shouldn't join NATO, but they are all the time twinning us together with NATO. I once accused the defense minister, you're doing a political moonwalk. You're moving in one direction, but it looks like you're on the other direction because your mouth is saying one thing, but your feet are saying something else.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has vowed to eliminate the NATO threat if Sweden were to join. For now, a country known for its role in diplomacy will have to walk a delicate line between military readiness and non-alignment, in a region seen as becoming more difficult to avoid taking sides. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers, from Sweden's Aurora 17 War Games.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Fagersta in central Sweden by Stig Henriksson, who you would have seen in our report. He's a member of the Swedish Parliament with the Left Party. In Stockholm, we have Anna Wieslander. She's the Secretary General of the Swedish Defence Association. And with me here in the studio is journalist Teresa Christiansen. She writes for a Swedish daily newspaper. I thank you all for joining us. Anna Wieslander, let me begin with you. Tell me why you think Sweden needs or needed the Aurora 17 War Games.
Well, Sweden had not exercised at this size for almost 20 years, so it was very much needed to have that. It's important for us to build up our military capability again when it comes to national defense. We had focused on international missions for a very long time, but we have not had that focus on national defense, and for that you need to exercise at large units and in cooperation with other countries.
Stig Henriksson, why can't it just be seen as a drill to keep Sweden secure, rather than, as some have said, oh no, this means 200 years of neutrality are now finished?
Well, I don't think 200 years of neutrality is finished, but I think it's not a good thing for Swedish security that we are sort of going even closer with NATO countries and having these sort of exercises. Of course, Sweden should have a national defense, and of course the national defense has to exercise. But having 6 NATO countries in this large scale, that isn't good for our security. The tension and the armament in the Baltic Sea region is increasing, and we shouldn't take part of that. We should do like Finland, our neighbor, who are not having these big exercises because they say this is not good. It's like putting oil to the fire.
Mm-hmm. Teresa, is this something that just happened right now in response to, say, the massive Russian drills that we saw in Belarus and elsewhere, or has this been a long time coming?
No, I mean, the relationship or the anti-relationship with especially Russia has been there for a long time. There has always been some sort of fear, you can say, for whatever Russia could do to Sweden. But also the relations with NATO or the non-relation has been up to discussion for several years, and it's kind of polarizing the population.
Anna, is the easiest solution for Sweden to just join NATO?
Well, there is no will in the present government to join NATO, so it's more of a theoretical question at this time. Neither the Social Democrats nor the Green Party are interested in that. So that is a political discussion that is ongoing. As we said here, it's polarized in that the government has one opinion and the opposition parties have another opinion. They think we should join NATO. Meanwhile, I believe it's important for Sweden's security to cooperate more closely with NATO, as we have been doing in close cooperation also with Finland for the past few years when it comes to Baltic Sea security. That increases security in the whole region.
Mm-hmm. Stig, it's interesting within the domestic political space, you and the far right, I guess, are interesting bedfellows here on this issue because you're both against it, even though you fundamentally disagree on many other things. But wouldn't you accept the fear from many others where they see Russian encroachment in Ukraine, they see Russia swallow up Crimea, they see Russia conduct war games in the Baltics and threaten these other countries? Don't you understand why perhaps your fellow countrymen feel they need to take all precautions and they need to maybe get help from further west if they don't have enough firepower?
Most people in Sweden, one has to say, is against the membership in NATO. That is an important thing for us. And of course, we are very critical to the Putin regime, what they're doing in Crimea and in Ukraine. But that doesn't consist that there is a threat against Sweden in that case. We have had 200 years of being out of military alliances, and we had over 200 years of peace. So it's a heavy burden on those who say, now we should change the scenario completely. Russia has always been there. Russia has sometimes been aggressive, sometimes has it been a victim of aggression, but it's always been there. And I say, we should continue that 200 years of being out of military alliances. It has served us very well.
Yeah, at the core of being a member of NATO is the fact that if there's an attack on one, there's an attack on all. That's why that collective security is so important. And there's a feeling that if you join NATO, that means that you have a bunch of friends if you're under attack. Gunnar Hult challenges that a little bit, the professor at Swedish Defence University. Let's have a little listen to what he said.
There is still a belief, long-term standing belief in Sweden that by not being in NATO, we can stay out of a future war. And to me, this is absolutely not true, because any future war in the Baltic area will involve Sweden in one way or the other. And it doesn't matter that if you claim to be a neutral country, you're not part of any alliance, you will be part of that future war.
Teresa, do you think he makes a decent point there?
Well, I mean, it's also a fact that even if Sweden are not part of NATO, we are still very close to NATO. For example, Sweden was in the international operations in Afghanistan for many years, and that was a NATO operation in some way. It started like a UN operation, but it involved into something else, where there was a war going on. So I don't think it's exactly true that we haven't been, that Sweden hasn't been close to NATO, and the way they are now could possibly continue as well.
Anna, when you see the Russians conduct that massive drill as they did with Zapad 17 in Belarus, what is the message that you take out of it? Because the Russians say, hey, we're just doing a drill to protect ourselves, just as everybody else does, just as the Americans do, just as NATO does. What's the message to you? How is it received on your end?
The main message from my end is that Russia is, since a few years back, since after the war they conducted on Georgia, rebuilding their military capability at quite substantial pace. They are investing $700 billion US dollars from 2011 to 2020. And you can see now that they have a considerable military capability, and they are showing that in exercises as Zapad 17. So, and that is of course a signal to the rest of the region and to the world to see. They want us also to see, and also for them to exercise their capability. So that's important to notice, of course. And the critique that has come out from on Russia for the Zapad exercises is that it has lacked transparency on what they are aiming to do and how many forces they are about to exercise, and also invitation of observing partners.
Anna, is it a little paradoxical maybe that even if Russia wasn't being antagonistic by those drills in the past, maybe if we took them for their word, or took them at their word that they weren't being antagonistic, now that Sweden is conducting its own drills and maybe getting cozier with NATO, now Russia will be antagonistic, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy?
No, I think that's really not the case. It's important to see what came first when it comes to Russia, because this is a talk that is going on. But I think it's important to see that Russia first attacked Georgia in 2008. It started a massive military buildup. It has also attacked Ukraine, illegally annexed Crimea, started a war in eastern Ukraine. It has said that it does not want the European security order that we have established in Europe since 25 years back. It wants something else that reflects the fact that Russia thinks it's fair to have a sphere of influence among its neighbors. So there is a long range of indicators that shows that Russia is conducting a much more aggressive stance towards Europe and its neighbors, and they want a change. That's very, very apparent. That's also what they are saying. And we have to respond to that, because otherwise you are creating new imbalances. This is not how it looked after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are in a more insecure situation in Europe, and if we do not respond to that, we will not reach a new level of stability.
Stig, Anna has laid out a compelling timeline. You can't disagree with that, can you?
Well, let me say first that Sweden has participated in 2 wars, in Afghanistan and Libya, both with results that are catastrophic. So I think that should be a signal too. And we're critical to the Russian armament, but still, the Russian military expenditure is 1/10 of NATO's, less than 1/10 of NATO. So you have to have the proportions there. And of course, big military exercises are bad for the security situation in our regions. Zapad 17 and Aurora 17 are both wrong in my view. But still, Russia isn't making their military exercises with Cuba outside the coast of Florida. They're making it near their homeland. And if there's somewhere you should have your military exercises, of course it should be around your own borders. But we have invited United States to participate in our drill, and I think that's a completely different signal. And even if we don't think in Sweden that this is anything bad, it shouldn't risen the tension and so on, but it signals that we are almost a member of NATO. And let me say that it could be like that if there would be a war around the Baltic Sea, that we could be part of it even if we don't choose it. But if we are a member of NATO, we are participating in that war from day one. That's the only sure guarantee that NATO can give us.
Teresa, tell me how many Swedes would agree with Stig in saying that inviting the Americans along to conduct this drill is a bad idea?
Well, I think the people who is on his side, which would be a lot of people actually, that is against NATO, which I think it's changed over time, of course, depending who is the governments and who is the presidents, etc., in the NATO countries. But I think there is as many that feel the fear that if we go with NATO, that's a sign of provocation. There is a huge historical honor and pride in Sweden of being some sort of neutral and fighters for the human rights. And of course, people are worried that would need to take a step back if Sweden would take another step towards military operations instead.
Yeah. Anna, is that idealism hitting its natural ceiling now where, okay, you can be a humanitarian superpower as you call yourself, you can stay neutral, but only up until a point. At some point, you have to be like other countries, which means, I don't know, spending more on defense in order to keep yourself safe. Is that a natural progression for Sweden now?
Well, actually, it was said earlier here that there is an opposition, there is a majority against NATO membership in Sweden. That is not what the polls are showing since the past few years. There is actually a majority for, if you look at the polls, ranging from between 35 to up to 50% for NATO membership. But there is also a group between 25-35 against NATO membership, and quite a big group that are not sure what they believe in NATO membership. So there has been a big shift from the past. It used to be 25% for NATO membership, and now it's up more, I would say, average around 40% for NATO membership. So there has been a change. And why is that a change? Well, people have seen, and polls also show this, people are worried about the developments in Russia, Russian behavior. So that's one driving force abroad. A driving force within Sweden is that people are worried that our defense capability is too low. It's actually 70% that believe that Sweden should, defense capability is too low, that we cannot defend Sweden, and they are worried about that. So all these indicators, I believe, an exercise like Aurora, a big exercise, most people actually think it's a good thing. But there has been a very vocal, loud voices who are against it, but I don't think that reflects the majority of the Swedish people. There are no polls that support that. A third factor, which is important when it comes to should we practice with the US, invite France, our Nordic neighbors, our Baltic neighbors, is that we have a security policy which is adopted by Parliament and all political parties, that Sweden should be able to give and take military support in case of a crisis. We do not have a defense policy that builds on Sweden defending solely itself. We should be able to give and take military support, and that's why we are exercising a national exercise together with other countries. And there is an interesting poll as well showing that actually 66% of the Swedes believe that if there is a crisis or war, Sweden will get fast and efficient help from abroad. And that is what 2/3 of the Swedes believe in. And that's also congruent with how we are exercising and how we are building our defense.
Stig, let me ask you, is your country changing? When we look at the opposition to Aurora, the best count that I could come across of those who took to the streets in opposition, usually from the left, were about 400 people. So with that in mind, I'll ask my last question to you. Is your country changing before your eyes? Is the idealism fading, and is Sweden starting to act more like, I don't know, other regular countries?
No, I don't think it's a question of idealism. We're very realistic and looking at the history.
Go ahead, Stig.
Excuse me, can I answer the question? Yes, and I was myself speaker in a meeting in Gothenburg, and we were 3,500 people there protesting against Aurora 17, so there had been a lot of massive protest. Then I and Anna perhaps see different polls. I have only seen one poll that more are in favor of NATO membership than against. But then again, it's not idealism. It's security policy is so much more than just looking at the military defense. Of course, we should have a military defense and it should be good and strong, but the very important part of security policy, it's diplomacy, it's trying to get disarmament, it's trying to get negotiations and lessen the tension in the region. And now the tension, and we are participating in rising the tension all the time, and that is a very bad thing for Swedish security. That's my point.
So, Teresa, let me ask you then very finally, with whatever Russia has done, whether it's seen as antagonistic or not, have the Russian actions and now the reactions from Sweden been a healthy test of Sweden trying to define what it wants to be in security policy and foreign policy in the years going forward?
Well, I think that depends which side you would ask. If it was a provocation towards Russia, or if it actually shows what Russia would do if there were an actual threat. But of course, I mean, this was an honest military training that has been done before elsewhere. So in that way, I think it was a kind of an obvious response from Russia.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to three Swedes about this. What does Sweden want? I'm a little bit closer in trying to understand, but I don't fully understand it yet. Fascinating covering your country as well. We don't often cover Sweden on the Newsmakers. Anna Wieslander, Stig Henriksson and Teresa Christiansen, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, President Donald Trump expels Cuban diplomats after Americans in Havana suffer mystery illnesses. Are US-Cuba relations breaking down? And crisis in the Congo. The UN cuts its peacekeeping budget and urges elections. But would that end the violence in the DRC? Welcome back. Former US President Barack Obama managed to restore relations with Cuba after half a century. But there's a chance that hard-earned diplomacy could now be unraveling. The White House has pulled embassy staff out of Havana, ordered Cuban officials to leave Washington, and issued a warning for Americans to stay away from the country. It all stems from a dispute that has many people puzzled. US diplomats working in Havana have been struck with mysterious illnesses ever since Trump took office. Is Cuba to blame? Natalie Pahonen takes a look.
Dizziness, headaches, hearing loss, cognitive issues, and difficulty sleeping. The US State Department says these are some of the symptoms experienced by at least 21 embassy staffers in Havana. And they developed them after a series of attacks of an unknown nature. What started as a diplomatic mystery has now turned into a diplomatic crisis. The American embassy in Havana has cut staff, stopped issuing visas to Cubans, and US citizens have been warned against travelling to the island. The US government has also expelled 15 Cuban diplomats from Washington, D.C. over what it says is Havana's failure to protect diplomats on Cuban soil. Cuba says it has no involvement in the alleged attacks and has been fully cooperating with investigations. And the government has labelled America's response unjustified.
By these politically motivated and thoughtless actions, the U.S. government is responsible for the current and possibly future deterioration of bilateral relations.
Those relations were only fully restored in 2015, thawing out 50 years of Cold War rhetoric which had divided the countries. That rapprochement with Havana was lauded as a key foreign policy achievement of Barack Obama during his time in office. But those closer ties and the benefits that were expected to flow from them have been curtailed since Donald Trump entered the White House. Here's President Trump in June.
I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba.
A message he repeated last week.
We will not lift sanctions on the Cuban regime until it delivers full political freedom for the Cuban people.
But can there be any real prospect of improved relations while this diplomatic health mystery remains unsolved? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to debate this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by John Suarez. He's the coordinator of the Free Cuba Foundation. And in London, we have Robert Miller. He's the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign Organization. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. John Suarez, let me begin with you. The first vice president in Cuba, who will probably succeed Castro, said these events in the region prove that, quote, imperialism can never be trusted, not even a tiny bit, never. I'm guessing you don't trust him. Tell me why.
Well, one, I don't trust him because his regime is engaged in imperialism in the region. There are thousands of Cuban troops in Venezuela installing a totalitarian regime there with Nicolas Maduro, subverting democracy as the Venezuelan people suffer more and more. I think also with regards to the crisis with the diplomats, a lot of people tend to forget that the Cuban government has a history of treating diplomats poorly, not only American, but Canadian. In the case of the Americans, there was a case of diplomat Robin Myers in 1996 that they were throwing cars at and trying to harm her because she was meeting with dissidents. There have been other cases where diplomats have found their mouthwash replaced with urine, pets murdered, threatening phone calls. So when the foreign minister says that Cuba has never engaged in this behavior that goes counter to the Vienna Convention of guaranteeing the protection of diplomats in their home territory, that's simply not true based on the historical record. Secondly, the Cuban government has a duty, whether or not they are actually involved in what's taking place, to protect those diplomats. Failing to do that, and some of these diplomats, in addition to the hearing loss, are having memory loss, there's some slight brain damage. The Americans prudentially pulled out their people, 60%. The 15 Cubans that were pulled out of the U.S. was to maintain equity or reciprocity. I don't think the administration actually came out punishing them for this, but saying, listen, we had to remove X number of American diplomats, so we're going to have you draw down X number of Cuban diplomats and maintain parity.
Okay, Robert Miller, let's for the moment accept that these acoustic attacks are a real thing, whoever might be doing them. These diplomats are getting sick, something's happening. Don't you think Cuba should maybe try to figure out what's going on or own up if it is behind it rather than denying it?
Well, my understanding is very clear that the Cuban government has done everything possible to investigate these so-called sonic attacks. In fact, there's been 3 or 4 visits by FBI officers to Havana to investigate with their highest level of scientific investigations. And to date, as John rightly pointed out, there has been no evidence of these attacks having taken place. And in fact, if there was evidence, I'm sure the American government would have shown that evidence to the world. In fact, what you've got is a return to the negative trajectory of anti-Cuban accusations and aggression, which has been the modus operandi, really, of US foreign policy towards the island for over 50 years. And it's a continuation of the blockade policies, the aggressive policies against an island, which is really just standing up on its own 2 feet. It's a sovereign country, and it's trying to do the best in a very difficult world. Really, these accusations have been forwarded by some very hardline Cuban Americans led by Senator Marco Rubio, who has made it very, very clear that he wants to return back to the old Cold War rhetoric and Cold War style relationship between the United States and Cuba. And quite frankly, in 2017, we should be moving forward, not backwards at this time.
So, John Suarez, negative trajectory, as Robert Miller puts it. Is the Trump administration trashing all the goodwill that was created and massaged and finessed under Barack Obama in 2015? Sure, Cuba's not perfect, but it was going in a certain direction. Has all of it been reversed now, John?
Well, I think that we need to, first off, I'd want to say that Mr. Miller said that, there was no evidence. There are evidence of attacks. The question is there evidence of involvement of the Cuban government? The Trump administration saying that has not been established, but that there has been harm done to these diplomats, whether it be sonic or something else. That's something that's not being debated. And it wasn't Marco Rubio who came out with that. It was frustrated diplomats that leaked it to CBS News, and they were being critical of the Trump administration for keeping quiet about it. The attacks began in November of 2016. There was no response by the Obama administration when they were engaging with Cuba. They were having bilateral meetings in December. They were having meetings in January where they lifted the medical parole program for doctors that are treated as slaves in third countries. Now those doctors are having to sue in places like Brazil to try to regain their freedom when before they could come to the US. That's one of the legacies of the Obama administration. But furthermore, the Trump administration began responding privately to the Cuban government in February, requesting explanations with what was going on with the diplomats quietly. It was not until August, when CBS News was going to break the story, some of these diplomats over social media were complaining about what was happening to them, that the administration was forced to respond. Right. And then you had Marco Rubio and other people saying this was unacceptable.
Okay.
But I'd also want to touch on one other issue. Hold on one moment, very quickly. On January 2nd, when they were having the review of military troops in Havana with Raul Castro in the stands, the military was chanting how they were going to shoot Barack Obama repeatedly in the head so many times that they would create a lead hat. So this idea that there was some sort of positive détente between the two countries is belied by the rhetoric of the Cuban government.
Well, hold on. So, John, are you saying that Obama was duped?
I'm saying that Obama had an agenda to try to push for this détente with Cuba, despite the behavior of Cuba. During their negotiations, Cuba was caught smuggling tons of weapons trying to smuggle tons of weapons to North Korea. The freighter was intercepted in Panama. It revealed MiGs, ballistic missile technology, tons of weapons. That was in 2013 when negotiations were underway. Right. 2014, a Hellfire missile during NATO exercises was intercepted in Europe and wound up in Cuba. The Cubans refused to return it until the Wall Street Journal broke the story in February of 2016.
As the President, John, of the United States of America, didn't he seize the moment because all the polls at the time in 2015 indicated that both sides, Americans and Cubans, wanted a better deal. They didn't want 50 years of blockade. They didn't want this anymore. Fine. Both countries maybe are imperfect. Maybe Cuba is more imperfect than the United States, but they wanted to move forward, right? All the polls indicated that. Wasn't Obama just seizing the moment?
But also the premise, hold on. President Obama's premise, first of all, is false. It hasn't been 50 years of blockade. 1977, Jimmy Carter normalized relations. He opened interest sections, which opened de facto embassies in Cuba and the United States, and he lifted the travel ban. What took place afterwards was an increase in hostility from Cuba with the increased resources, the export of revolution to places like Nicaragua, and that warming, that opening, cooled off. And you also saw with the Mariel boat lift, where Mr. Castro sprinkled criminal elements into this mass exodus, that helped sink President Carter's re-election chances in 1980. And with Ronald Reagan, there was a rollback in those policies. We saw that again repeated in the 1990s with Bill Clinton, where they opened up trade. There's been trade between Cuba and the United States since 2000, approximately $5 billion worth of trade. Paradoxically, the trade dried up during the Obama years when he was pushing for normalization.
Okay, so Robert, every time the US extended the olive branch, it was the Cubans who preferred isolation, who preferred blockade.
I'm afraid that's ridiculous. The blockade has been in place for almost 60 years without fail. There have been some lightnings of some of the elements of the blockade.
What blockade, sir?
Obama
Explain to me the blockade.
Some changes. The blockade is a real blockade. It is extraterritorial. There are companies in Britain that have paid hundreds of millions of dollars of fines to the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the US Treasury, purely for their desire and their trade with Cuba. It is a blockade. It is a blockade that is condemned every year for the last 20 years at the United Nations by every single country of the world, except two, the United States and Israel. And even the United States and Israel last year abstained on that vote. So 191 countries have condemned the extraterritorial nature of the blockade that does exist and affects Cuba.
Robert,
Cuba is a sovereign country
Robert,
of just 11 million people.
A blockade,
hold on for a second.
Military action with ships surrounding
John.
an island. There has not been a blockade since 1962.
Okay,
so
you disagree on whether there's a blockade
sanctions.
or not. Hold on, John, just give me a second. Robert, let me ask you...
No, it's a question of definition.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you, Robert, do you agree that the following things would be good for Cuba? Free elections in Cuba, legalization of multiple political parties, the release of political prisoners, and respect for human rights. Do you agree, Robert, that those would be good things?
Cuba is a sovereign country. It has its way of
so it can
decide, society.
It can decide not to have a
elections.
So it can decide not to have a system with any of that, and that's fine by you.
It can have its democratic system. There will be elections again next year in February, and there will be a national general election. It is very, very different
to elections in the United States. Are you genuinely telling me, Robert, that Cuba has free elections?
Cuba has democratic elections, yes, I am telling you that. And I'll give you an example. In November this year, six members of the Cuban Parliament, MPs, members of Parliament, are coming to the British Parliament, the mother of all parliaments in our democratic country.
Let me follow through the thought.
As part of the Inter-Parliamentary Union,
okay,
as a formal exchange between members of Parliament in Cuba and in Britain.
Okay, so it's recognised by some in Britain. Fair enough.
It's very different, but it is their system.
It's their system, so there's a relativism here. But I'm going to park that aside. Let me follow through the thought. Helms-Burton in 1996 lists those things, but according to US law, it lists those things and says if Cuba makes movement towards those things being achieved, then we don't have to have sanctions on Cuba anymore, and we don't have to have a blockade on Cuba anymore. So that's US law. Isn't Trump just basically... So Robert, isn't Trump just basically adhering to US law, no more, no less?
Why is the world's biggest superpower unilaterally blockading another country? Why? Why is that happening? Why is the world's biggest superpower unilaterally blockading
there was a brief blockade in 1962. Sir, there was a brief blockade in 1962
well,
when there were nuclear missiles placed by the Soviet Union. Since there has not been a blockade. There are economic sanctions in place. It's not true. And I also want to point out another thing. You talk about democracy. In Cuba, when the Cuban people have organized petition drives to change the law as is currently outlined in the Cuban Constitution, well, it was as of 92 and 2002. Osvaldo Payá Sardinias with the Varela Project obtained 25,000 signatures for reforms of the system to bring it in line with human rights, something popular with many Cubans. That was rejected by the regime. They locked up most of the members of that movement with sentences ranging from 15 to 28 years in prison. Their wives had to go to the streets for almost 10 years protesting, beaten down in the streets.
Respect, you're just spouting a load of nonsense, really. One after another after another.
It's not nonsense, it's historical fact.
It existed in 61.
You want to rewrite history. You want to say Cuba has democratic elections when it's a one-party dictatorship.
Let me change the word to embargo.
There's only one legal political party.
Okay, John.
My friend, please.
John, can I change the word to embargo? Would you accept it's an embargo, John? It's an embargo, right? Can we accept that?
I would accept that it's embargo or economic sanctions.
Okay,
but
so
definitely not a blockade.
So
a blockade
again,
is a very specific
okay,
thing.
so let me then.
Okay,
so I don't want to get into a semantics debate over the words, right? Let's accept that it's an embargo for the sake of this discussion. Let me go back to those polls that I mentioned.
Well, I'm not going to accept that Cuba's a democracy like this individual.
Exactly, and Robert, that's a very relativistic and inaccurate definition of democracy. But again, let's put that aside for a second, John. Those polls that I mentioned in 2015...
Sorry, it's not an inaccurate...
Of course.
Not an inaccurate
Come on, Robert. You can't call Cuba a democracy. It's absurd. Robert, it's absurd to call it a democracy.
Why is that absurd? Why?
You're telling me they are free and fair elections in Cuba.
The Cubans participate in elections. Yeah, I am telling you, yeah.
Okay.
John, I'm not talking here about North Korea, are we?
John.
Look, John, You're denying a blockade that your country has your country has unilaterally imposed on another country.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to bring in John. John, I want to ask you about those polls in 2015. At the time of the deal, right, we had 59% of Republicans in the US favoring the scrapping of the embargo. There was a poll within Cuba, 97% of Cubans wanting better relations with the US, 73% of Americans wanting to re-establish diplomatic relations, 72% wanting to end the embargo. This was what people had wanted. Are you comfortable with this administration moving in a direction...
That's Cuban Americans. That is Cuban Americans also.
John, are you comfortable with this administration moving in the direction towards flushing all of that goodwill down the toilet?
First, I think that when you have a government that's engaging in subverting a democratic government in the region, which is what it has done in Venezuela, that is not acting in good faith in the region because it has a definite ideological agenda. And when you talk about Raul Castro stepping down, he'll be stepping down from the post of president, but he'll be staying on as head of the Communist Party. And his son, Alejandro Castro, seems to be poised to be in a very important position, whether formally or informally. So we're talking a very brutal, totalitarian, communist dictatorship with an agenda of subverting other countries in the region. And Venezuela is a case in point that is taking place today, where there are thousands of Cuban troops on the ground, and what the Secretary of the Organization of American States has described as an occupying force.
Okay.
And I think subsidizing that is not in the interest of the United States, nor in the interest of the Venezuelan people or the Cuban people.
Okay, just enough time for Robert for a final response. Robert?
Yeah, I think the United States needs to have a very long look at its history. Going right back to 1973 in Chile, when Salvador Allende was democratically elected. How did the United States respond? In the 1980s, in Nicaragua, how did the United States respond? In Venezuela right now, and in Cuba, the United States seems to think that it has the responsibility to enforce its doctrine, its way of doing things across that hemisphere. And it's unacceptable. And in the modern world, it's far better to talk and talk with people, despite our differences. Nowhere is perfect, as you yourself said at the beginning of this interview. But it is far better to have dialogue, as President Obama and President Castro showed when they mutually agreed to normalise relations and open those embassies. What we're seeing now is a Trump and Rubio drive to turn us back to a Cold War anachronistic relationship between the two countries. And I think people in America, in the Cuban-American community in America, and across the world, will be very, very saddened about that.
Okay, gentlemen. Unfortunately, I've got to move on, but I have appreciated you both taking the time to talk to us on the Newsmakers. John Suarez and Robert Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Toutes les institutions politiques de la RDC sont illégitimes.
All the political institutions of the DRC are illegitimate, so we must think about how to return to constitutional order. December 2017 is approaching, when elections are supposed to be held. Nothing has been done. The Congolese people must stand up.
Militants have attacked and killed another UN peacekeeper at a base in the Democratic Republic of Congo, adding to a growing death toll for the force in recent weeks. It happened in the east of the country, which has been racked with violence for years. Earlier this month, the UN announced it was cutting the budget for its peacekeeping force there. Secretary General Antonio Guterres is urging the country to hold elections. President Joseph Kabila says they'll happen soon, but his mandate expired last year, and his refusal to step down is adding to the political uncertainty. But if the opposition took power, would they be able to quell the attacks? Well, to help unpack these issues, I'm joined now by Michael Chibangu in the English city of Leicester. He's the president of the Association for Development and Democracy in Congo, which works with the opposition in the DRC. Michael, good to have you on the Newsmakers. So the UN saying that we're going to have a bit of a drawdown when it comes to peacekeepers, right? Or as they call them, MONUSCO. But then we're having attacks in the past couple months, which means that the UN gets sucked in even more and they have to add individuals or dozens of peacekeepers to it. Where do you stand on the peacekeepers issue? Should UN peacekeepers leave or should there be more of them?
Unfortunately, as you have mentioned, the situation on the ground in DRC is actually getting worse. So to think about pulling down the number of UN troops at this particular time wouldn't be reasonable, because if you look at the attacks or the situation on the ground, you'll find that not only you have rebels or attacking the population, but you also have the Congolese army. Much of the abuses that are committed on the ground are also down to the fact that soldiers in the army are unpaid and they are living on the back of the population. So wherever there are problems and the soldiers are deployed, we notice an increase of abuse and attacks. So the UN actually provide security for the population. So I think that the decision should be delayed until there's political stability.
Yeah, so the UN Secretary General, in trying to explain the cut, had said that what is needed fundamentally in DRC is fresh elections. And I guess nobody really disagrees with that, except maybe for Joseph Kabila. But let me then ask you, would there be much of a difference if the opposition came to power, given that the East has become so ungovernable, right? So you're saying the army is committing atrocities. They are committing atrocities, but you also have Mai, you have LRA, you have CNPSC, you have a bunch of groups doing terrible things. So does it necessarily mean that if Kabila, holds fresh elections and the opposition comes to power, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll keep the East under control, does it?
Well, I think it may well do, because you have Joseph Kabila has been in power for now 16 years and counting, and he clearly has failed to bring stability into Congo. So this obviously he cannot continue. With him, the situation is not going to improve. It's actually going to get worse. So that we think with someone else, at least there will be a chance of improving the situation on the ground, because we've seen that under his leadership, the army has not improved. The army is part of the group you've mentioned, a number of different groups that are committing atrocity in DRC. Unfortunately, you also have the government that is counted, the army that is part of it, which it shouldn't be the case. The army should be there to protect the population. And clearly, Kabila has failed. That's part of the reason why people want him to leave power so badly, because after 16 years in power, we're seeing that when things are not getting better, they are getting worse. And more we see different groups rising, even in parts of the country where we previously had no problems. For example, in the areas such as the Kasai, which is in central Congo, they didn't have problems before, but now we have problems there, instability.
But then, again, let me ask you, what makes you think that any opposition figure would have the authority, both in a political and moral sense, to get those armed groups to put down their weapons?
Well, you see, one of the reasons why we have so many armed groups is because of the lack of legitimacy and the lack of support that Kabila has. So you have people forming local defense group because there's obviously a vacuum there, and also you have a leader that is contested. You have people rising up against him, fighting him, wanting him to leave, and even in different areas. When you hear this, the reason why you're trying to look at the reason why people are fighting, there's so much instability, is but because of the leader is not accepted. He has lost all legitimacy. We believe that with election, we will have someone that the people support. That alone will reduce the number of problems, and with that, the president will have a mandate to restore and reform the armed services and give them the necessary means to fight, because it hasn't been the case for 16 years. And we have people in the position who are competent, who are also popular, and who want election that unfortunately haven't happened, and we don't know when they will happen.
If those elections don't happen, there are some who fear that the DRC will slip into civil war again. There's been a low intensity, I guess, according to the best definition out there, but it's still not a great definition. There's been a low intensity conflict, mainly in the East, for more than 2 decades, right? But there hasn't been civil war for a long time. There are those who fear it will slip back into civil war. Is that an exaggeration, or is it real?
It is not an exaggeration. It's actually real. What is happening on the ground progressively, Kabila is losing control of the country. And now with this problem of election with him, he's done his 2 terms. The constitution says that he cannot stand again. But instead of going, what does he do? He delays the election to stay longer in power. And this is actually bringing the country to a point where if he refuses to leave, people will have no other choices but to either take it to the street or take arms, which is something that will not be good for the country. But it's all down to Joseph Kabila's refusal to leave power. It's not an exaggeration. We are reading there, we are seeing it happening, but unfortunately, not much is done to prevent it.
Michael Shabangu, it's been great to have you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us from Leicester. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, we look at Turkey's tit-for-tat diplomatic spat with the US as both sides suspend visa services in each other's countries. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.